You're listening to the Virginia Press Room,
a joint production of the Virginia Public Access Project
and VPM. Now here's the host of the Press Room, Michael Pope.
In the Press Room this week, we are joined by an all-star panel of journalists from the Virginia Press Corps. First up is the state politics reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Dave Ress. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We are also joined by a political science professor at Randolph-Macon College, who is also the host of the VPM podcast, RVA's Got Issues, Rich Marr. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Long time, first time, as they say. Just very excited to be here.
And we're glad that you're here. Rounding out our all-star panel is the policy reporter for the Virginia Mercury, Nathaniel Klein. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right, let's get right into it with our headlines of the week. Dave Ress with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. You're first with this. What's your headline of the week?
Well, actually, I hate to say it, I had two, and they're kind of related. They both, one was the big bill about creating a legal retail market for marijuana, and the other was a bill that deals with allowing localities to do a surcharge and sales tax to finance school construction. What brings these two together is they were both essentially vetoed last year by the governor, and the legislature is trying yet again. Preliminary indicators are that it's not really going to get past the governor, but it's one of those things, legislators like to keep on trying, and of course, it is an election year, and we may hear more about that later this year.
Yeah, I think it's like there's a sort of dual purpose to these kinds of bills, right? There's the long game that legislators often play, like you just keep bringing something back. Mm-hmm. Isn't Danica Ream like continuing to hit just creep a little bit more, get a few more votes every year on some of the things that she cares about? But then there's also the election year gambit, right? Like get your opponent, or at least your opponent's party on the record to say like, yeah, they're opposed to this, so this is why you need to vote for us this year. So both of those things at play this year.
I kind of remember the late Senator John Miller from Down Newport News tried, I think, by my count, 8 years to get a required bill about physical education for, I think, elementary school students. It kept butting into the, we don't need another unfunded mandate.
Right.
And he kept trying, and it basically came down to, as he said, the easy stuff happens. The hard stuff takes a little while.
Yeah, I bet some middle school kids who had a tough time in gym are real happy about his persistence.
Yeah.
Yeah, with one, like with the retail marketplace for marijuana, like that's a really complicated bill that has lots of parts and pages and pages and pages.
82 pages.
Yeah, and 82 to be specific. And you got to feel for these people to put all this work into something knowing they're going to get a veto at the end of the day, right?
Well, I think Paul Krajicek was basically saying we want to keep the issue going. He did pick up some additional support from the other side, despite the fact that it's become kind of essentially sort of a loyalty test. But there were a handful of Republicans in the House who shifted over. And it's the sort of thing where he says, as people get more and more used to the idea, it's eventually going to happen. And of course, I mean, the decisive factor is the governor's opposition. In 2026, there will be a different governor, whoever it is.
And I believe this is the first year we've seen the school construction language in the budget. So that bill is heading to the governor here soon. But I wonder, is that going to stay in the budget as well? So, school construction has been a big issue, obviously. Schools have been in a mess. So.
This week, I guess we'll find out the answer to that question, right? Yeah. Rich Marr, VPM News, you're next on this. What's your headline of the week?
Well, I don't have two bylines or even one this week, Dave, but I've been following some reporting by Natalie Anderson over at the Virginian Pilot Daily Press about the residency of Senator Christy New Craig. So Senator Craig represents Senate District 19. She was elected in 2023. This is Southwest Virginia, includes parts of Chesapeake and Virginia Beach. And apparently she used this Chesapeake address, but wasn't on the lease. And so last week she produced some documentation that she said proves that she was in fact a resident at this place, and that even though it was owned by her campaign manager, she did actually go and live there. But this is a perennial issue in the General Assembly, and particularly, we're still having the fallout from our redistricting from the 2020 census. Craig elected in 2023, the first Senate election after the redistricting. Do representatives live in their district, right? We require that of them. And there's a principle of democracy behind it, the idea that the people who represent us, they live among us, they're part of us. But I feel like this just comes up every year and will continue to come up. It's even happening at the local level. Virginia State Police have investigated and I think even arrested a Blacksburg town council person this month. There've been longstanding rumors about city council members in lots of cities across the Commonwealth. And I think it's just this question of, like, what do we want from our democracy? Do we want people who live among us? And I think these questions have been trumped more lately for parties and even constituents. They want their number. They want their Democrat or their Republican. They care less about where they live or whether they actually live there.
This debate is also kind of nuanced because what does it mean to live somewhere? Like, if you're there one day a week, are you living there?
Right.
Or, I mean, how frequently do you have to sleep there? And then how do you prove that you slept at a specific address? You know what I'm saying? Like, there's nuance to what does it mean to live somewhere?
There's actually a really funny, I find it funny, report from the Virginia State Police about Mark Early. He was investigated, another legislator, a few years ago and was cleared of all charges, but in part because a Virginia State Police investigator followed him home every day to make sure he's going where he said he was going, right? Wow. Checking documentation and things like that. But yeah, what does it mean to live somewhere when people might have two addresses, particularly to represent a district? It's a tough one.
I was getting ready to ask you in 2025, are we going to start putting trackers in lawmakers? To see where they're staying? So.
A lawmaker LoJack. I think it's maybe that bill can come along next year.
Are they sharing their location with their constituents?
Yeah.
Right. Nathaniel Klein at the Virginia Mercury, you're next on this. What's your headline of the week?
Well, last week, everyone knows that the casino bill that Majority Senate Leader Scott Survell was carrying was laid on the table for the day. And that committee is not planning on meeting, as far as we know, before session ends. And so that was a real big deal for that area. And for supporters, they were looking for jobs, job creation. But opponents were concerned that community support wasn't enough. There wasn't enough community support around the bill. And then also just there was maybe one or two eligible places of where this casino could have gone. And so that kind of really upset some of the constituents in that area. And so here we are at this point. So,
and the Fairfax County delegation was very divided on this. Obviously, Survell was a supporter, but then you had other people in the delegation who were not just against it, but very much against it. You know, case in point, Senator Jennifer Boysko of Herndon not only opposed it on the Senate floor when they debated it, she showed up in the subcommittee to testify against Survell's bill, an action that I have never seen something like that happen, and there was some fallout from that, Nate. Senator Boysko lost her position as chairman of the Transportation Committee. She's still on the Transportation Committee, but she's no longer chair. She also got kicked off of Rules, and Senator Bagby took her place on Rules. So, Nate, do you think there's more fallout to come here on the casino story?
I can't imagine a sharper decline right now with positions like that. It's incredible, but we're just going to find out more as we move along here with this last week of the session going on. It was a rare moment to see a lawmaker getting in line with other speakers in opposition for something. I was even talking to some lawmakers last week about that. I'm like, have you all ever seen this before? And there have been a handful of cases that have happened, but it's just not a practice that you usually see lawmakers doing.
It's usually, so when in previous examples when this has happened, it seems like it's freshmen who just show up and they don't really know all the traditions and the rules, and it's a different story for a freshman to show up versus someone of the seniority of Senator Boysko, who is chair of an important committee.
Yeah, casinos, man. Legislators think it's like free money, and I know coming from Richmond, where there was some pretty fraught politics around a casino, racial politics. Mayor Stoney, who's now running for lieutenant governor, was hoping to cement a legacy by not only bringing a vote, but then bringing a vote again after he got the results he didn't like. And I think that's been damaging for him politically, and now we're seeing it kind of divide the Democrats up in Northern Virginia. So I wonder if the casino politics are going to take a back seat after this year, considering how kind of controversial they've become.
Yeah, and even the Fairfax County chair, McKay actually was on the record just saying like he doesn't think that this is going to be done. It's going to be back. So we'll just see what happens. But, they have a year to kind of figure out, okay, well, what went wrong this time around and what should we do? I will also mention that Delegate Kreisig, if I'm pronouncing it correctly here, he actually was the one that actually spoke about this bill in that subcommittee. And he mentioned, look, hey, we need to have some sort of regulations put in place first because there's a rise in gaming right now, and we need to get that straight first. And so he has something in the budget. We'll see if it passes or not first.
All right, now it's time for some insider info. This is when our top reporters reveal the story behind the story, giving us an inside scoop on Virginia politics. Rich Marr of VPM News, you're first with this. What's your insider info?
Well, I'm not a kind of daily reporter like you folks and in the General Assembly all that much, so I thought I'd share some insider info from my side hustle as a Randolph-Macon College professor. And I know a question I'm often asked is, how does a part-time legislature work? Like, how can these part-time legislators who have minimal staff and are only supposed to be there a few months deal with these thousands and thousands of bills? And the answer is free labor from interns, right? Interns are running around, these young folks, college students, even high school students, running around the General Assembly, and they are given pretty big responsibility very quickly. I know this is a pandemic story, but one of the interns from my college was working for a senator in January, and within about 2 weeks, he was running the whole office. There was nobody else there, so he was managing the schedule and meeting with constituents. And so I think they generally do a great job, and I like it for my students. It gives them huge, experience and great networking. But it does raise this ongoing question, right? How long can we do this? How long can we maintain this part-time legislature? I like the idea of a citizen legislator, like someone like Schuyler Van Valkenburg, the high school teacher who goes back to teaching his students after the session is over. But with so many bills and special sessions and little attention paid to the budget, it's a question for me how long we can keep this going. In the meantime, if you're a constituent or even a lobbyist and you're trying to meet with a legislator, the person you may end up meeting with is a 20-year-old college student who's been on the job for about 2.5 weeks, and you're counting on them to bring your position back to that legislator. And I think it works pretty well, but I just wonder about the wisdom of it long term.
There is a real upside to that for journalists because those interns are great sources. And usually they are podcast listeners. And so, they know who I am. And so you can chat them up and learn their names, and they'll tell you what's going on. As long as you don't use their name on the radio, I think they're fine with talking about it. Nathaniel Klein of the Virginia Mercury, you're next on this. What's your insider info?
So Delegate Dale McClure is actually carrying a bill to change the original Washington football name to the Commanders. And so what's going to end with on their specialty license plate. So if you go to DMV now and you want to support your football team, you can actually go get these specialty license plates. But under current law right now, it still has the existing name. It's still in the Virginia Code. You can still find it. So what they want to do is they want to be able to just take the old name out and put the new one in. Especially, I think it was that back in 2022, where the original name was under a lot of scrutiny, and so eventually the franchise moved to changing its name, and so here we are today. So
now on the license plates, there are still really old license plates driving around Virginia, like there are Robert E. Lee license plates, right? You can just get a sticker and keep your old license plate, right?
Right, that's correct. And with these particular bills, if you still have them and you just keep up with the renewal of them, you can still keep the plates. The bill does not include like a recall on these license plates. So,
And I think this year is probably a good year for this bill, right? With all the success that Commanders had. I mean, I think a lot of fans who were holding on to that old name, this was the year that they finally gave it up and felt like the Commanders were the Commanders. So
yeah, and I will add something to that. I mean, just this bill actually showed a lot of camaraderie in the General Assembly, and I actually pulled out two of my favorite quotes, actually. This one came after the House passed it 92-5. One of those that said nay to this was Speaker Don Scott, who said, "You've got to respect the petty." And then in the Senate Transportation Committee last week as well, one of my other favorite quotes was from Senator Hackworth. He said, "As a lifelong fan of the Dallas Cowboys, I'm going to turn my eyes and I'm going to hit the green button on this one." So,
Dave Ress with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. What's your insider info?
Mine is actually kind of about the part-time legislature. I had a story about an effort to help kids who are aging out of foster care. And the genesis of it turns out to be a really impassioned volunteer down at an agency in Virginia Beach that helps young adults making the transition from foster care to adulthood. It's often a really difficult one. But she's been agitating. I remember meeting her 2-3 years ago for saying we need to extend the amount of state support over time for young people, she was proposing till they're about 23. Well, she got the ear of Ann Tata, who's a delegate from down that way, who has become very impassioned about foster care issues. Got the bill through unanimously through the House of Delegates. Got through the Senate Rehab and Social Services Committee, but it ran into the infamous clause.
The clause. Explain the clause for our listeners.
The clause is the part of the bill that says, there's a fiscal impact, and you gotta therefore go to Senate Finance, where many bills go to die. I don't know about you, Michael. I've always sort of heard it as the clause, like the claws of a tiger that drags something back. It actually refers to the grammatical spelling of the clause, but unfortunately for all that consensus, and unfortunately for the passion of the citizen advocate and then the citizen legislator, the bill is not going to go forward this year.
Yeah, the clause, Senate Finance. I mean, it's working the way it's intended to, right? This is a mechanism that's used to kind of slow down the workflow, slow down the pace of change. It's a leftover from, I think, a legislature that's been used to doing a little bit less. Again, one of these features of the sort of older way of doing things, I think.
I kind of wonder about it because you end up having, we do have this process of sort of, hearing and considering and, through the House subcommittee, committee, full House, onto the Senate, Senate committee, full committee. But it's still like, why do we say a kind of a select body of 15 senators sort of really have a veto over, I mean, literally hundreds, probably thousands, at least several hundred bills that work through the General Assembly? It's kind of, do we have a process for considering policy, or do we turn it into a process about budget?
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add on to about Delegate Tata, I know she's been a champion for foster children, especially there was one bill that I came across, I believe it was last session, where she was looking for, when she was trying to support foster children that were actually going to colleges. Yep. And I hadn't even thought about it. I was like, where do they go after school is over? And so so the bill was actually trying to make sure that students had, those children actually, or those students, they're actually grown students now, have the ability to have somewhere to stay. And so I thought that was interesting.
It's kind of important to remember that when a kid ages out of foster care at 18, it can mean basically two things. One of which is that whatever trauma got them into foster care is relatively recent. And the other is that whatever trauma got them into foster care was real trauma and takes, it's really hard to get over. I mean, these young people really, you remember being 18. Got to find a job, got to find a place to live, got to think about, how am I going to go to college if you want to do that? It can be really quite overwhelming. And they're an extremely vulnerable group that I think really have tugged at the hearts of not just Delegate Tata, but a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
On a lighter note, now it's time for our game show segment, Buy, Sell, or Hold. I'll present a topic, and our panelists will make a choice. Do you want to buy, sell, or hold? Our topic today, props, as in members of the House of Delegates bringing props onto the floor to make a point. Perhaps the most famous example of this is former Delegate Joe Morrissey, who brought an assault rifle onto the floor of the House to make a point about gun violence. And then there's the time that Delegate Scott Suravel wore a feather boa and a cowboy on the hat as part of a character he called Mr. Hollywood to make a point about the motion picture tax credit. So this is the topic for today, the use of props. Nathaniel Klein of the Virginia Mercury, you're first on this. Buy, sell, or hold on props.
Well, considering we were talking about the casino earlier, I'm going to buy this. And the reason why I'm a former mascot wearer, so I'm familiar with putting costumes on in schools. So I buy this. I do think that there needs to be some sort of guidelines or something, not to not have any weapons actually come in the General Assembly, maybe possibly. But I mean,
the assault rifle made an impression.
Yeah, and everyone remembers it. We're talking about it in 2025. So, but no, I buy it. Just within reason. So.
Yeah, I think we see it less these days because I get the impression that Speaker Scott might not, you wouldn't want to do something to make the speaker mad at you. You know what I'm saying? So you wouldn't want to be silly in a way that is going to make you in a position that you might, there might be some politics of revenge going on.
But it makes for good photos for us.
It does make for good photos.
And people
fun,
are going to click on those.
Yeah, but only in the House. No props in the Senate. It's against the Senate rules. Dave Rest of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, you're next on this. Buy, sell, or hold on the use of props.
I'm a sell, and I have no sense of humor. I'm a really boring nerd.
Fact check, not true.
Yeah.
What I really want to do is just hear what the issue is, and hopefully get live up to my 7th grade civics class illusion that this is serious business.
Okay, so you take the Senate approach. No props in the Senate. Rich Marr, VPM News. Buy, sell, or hold on the use of props.
Yeah, I have to disagree with Dave here because, but on the same grounds, right? My sort of civics background, because politics is about storytelling. And props help you tell stories. And part of what legislators are trying to do on the floor, if we hope that people are paying attention at all, is not just to convince their colleagues, but they're making public speeches, right? They're trying to make a case for particular policies. And if it helps them to hold not a loaded weapon, as Nate was saying, but to hold up some fun stuff or to dress up in fancy costumes. And really, honestly, I know it's serious business, but if anything that lessens a little bit of the chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia. I just don't like that stuff. These are human beings. They're all colleagues and friends, and let's loosen it up a little bit. Plus, it does make for some cringe-worthy video that we might be able to pull out for TikToks and things like that. Yeah, memes. It's all about the memes.
Sadly, no props in the press room today. Nobody brought any. Okay, all right. Well, then let's move on. Okay, now it's time to open up our reporter's notebook. This is when our top journalists tell us what to be on the lookout for this week. Dave Rest of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, you're first on this. What's in your reporter's notebook?
Well, I have a story that's a little bit inside baseball, I suppose. But I've been talking to the members of the freshman group. We've had probably the largest freshman, first-term legislative group in, decades, maybe since 1619. And basically sort of saying, well, it's the second year you were here. Your first year was last year. What have you learned? What are the kind of the tricks of the trade that make you feel more effective? And hopefully that'll be out in the paper sometime next week.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You think about, you're a freshman, you don't really know the rules, you don't know the traditions, you show up, and that's your first year. So then your second year, you're still a freshman, but you got a better sense of what's going on. And do you get the sense that there maybe are successful in things this year that they weren't successful in last year?
Oh, yeah, very much. And so some of what the story is going to be about is sort of saying, well, very politely, what did you goof up your first year, and what did you fix this year? We got a couple of examples of that. Some of them are still haven't gone all the way yet, but some of them have.
Yeah, and what's great about that too is they're not. It's not like 400 level courses, right? To speak in my college terms, right? It's really the basics, but the basics that they've just learned and be able to put into practice. So I think that's going to be really accessible. I'm excited to read that.
Yep.
Subscribe to the Richmond Times-Dispatch so you
Please
can read
do.
the story.
Yeah.
Rich Marr, VPM News, you're next on this. What's in your reporter's notebook?
Yeah, I am thinking of when, forgive me this digression, but when James Carville, the Clinton era political strategist, came to our campus, and I asked him a question about an upcoming election, and he was like, y'all like the people from Louisiana, we're having breakfast and you're asking about dinner. And so, first of all, my apologies to anyone from Louisiana about that impression. But also, like, I'm thinking about the veto session. Like, I'm thinking about how much of what's happening right now in the General Assembly and really over the last few weeks has been defined by Glenn Youngkin's veto pen, right? It's about what they're anticipating. You know, we've had, huge debates last year that became kind of passed through because they know it's going to get vetoed or it's not. And so I really am really fascinated about how that politics is going to shake out, particularly, too, about Glenn Youngkin's legacy. There's been a lot of talk about that. You know, he keeps trying to make it about something substantive like an arena or a tax reform. But I really think, ironically, he's going to be defined in the same way that the guy he defeated was, Terry McAuliffe, because Terry McAuliffe was the blue wall, right? He vetoed a bunch of stuff that Republicans were doing. He could point to that and say, look, I blocked all this bad stuff that the Republicans were doing. And I think Glenn Youngkin will be able to say, if he thinks about it, like, I was able to block all this terrible stuff that Democrats were able to do. I think that's going to be the real legacy of Youngkin's time as governor. So I want to know how this veto session is going to shake out. You know, what is he actually going to attack? What are his amendments? What are the General Assembly going to be able to bring back and resurrect and whatnot?
If it helps, I keep trying to push the governor's office to say, well, here's this one, here's that one. He's got anything fresh to say?
Yeah.
And so far it's well, just look at our statement last year. So we'll see what happens.
I would love to compare emails with you just to see the same responses. So.
I would like the veto messages to be a little more fulsome. You know, sometimes there's just like a sentence, and I want a little more logic behind the veto. Some of them are, go on, but some of them you read and you kind of want more.
Yeah.
All right. Closing out our podcast with a strong finish, Nathaniel Klein of the Virginia Mercury. What's in your reporter's notebook?
So I'm already looking ahead to the budget. I want to see what's still going to be in there, what's going to be taken out. And one particular one I'm looking at is a $500,000 budget amendment to support food pantries at public and nonprofit private colleges that are participating in tuition assistance programs. Delegate Cousins and Senator Rome are carrying the legislative bills, which are moving along. But there's also this budget amendment just in case those bills don't work out. And so I'm curious to see what that's going to look like, if that's going to still stay in there, because the SHEV, or the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia.
Well done.
SHEV.
Put out a study basically just saying how much colleges and universities knew just about how students were dealing with food insecurities. And so this was their answer. And so we're going to just see what happens with the legislative body and the budget.
I think it's really great that you're following that, too. There's just so much that goes into the budget, and sometimes it is a kind of end around or a cap or an alternative path to get legislation that was dropped along the way back onto the table. So I'm fascinated by things.
Yeah,
like that.
and I will share. I did get one email before the session about this, and someone even questioned, well, if they're college students, like, why don't they have any food? Why don't they have the ability to eat and so forth? And and I actually documented a story recently about this. Is that you have some first generation students that are going to school now, and they're just trying to figure it out themselves, and they're also kind of like financially dependent as well. So there's just a lot of factors that haven't been considered, and so we're just going to kind of see what happens here soon. So
what really bothers me about the budget process is that it's done in secret, right? So there's the House budget and the Senate budget, and in order to reconcile them, they go behind closed doors in a secret conference committee that's not open to the public, not open to the press, and they make all the decisions behind closed doors, right? Does this bother anybody else? This does not seem like good government to me.
I mean, it's kind of like what Dave was saying earlier about the Senate Finance Committee, right? It's a small select group that gets to make big decisions, and is it really a democracy for doing that?
We used to be the head of the House Appropriations Committee and the head of the Senate Finance Committee, Bob Ball and Hunter Thompson. Sorry, going way back here. Both of them were rather portly gentlemen, and they also tended to disagree a lot. And the process of finally coming together on a budget was described as bumping bellies.
And he said he wasn't any fun.
Yeah. No sense of humor here.
Fact check, not true.
This is the press room. We're busy.
That's it for this episode of The Press Room. Hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcasting app. Write a review on Apple Podcasts, and we'll be back next week for the next episode of The Virginia Press Room.